I drove into the northern part of Alberta in the summer of 2019, a little more than an hour past the last small town where the gas station looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. I was 26 then, still thinking I could handle long stretches of silence and forests that felt too large to exist in one lifetime. I had planned the trip for weeks. I wanted a simple weekend alone, nothing complicated, just a tent, a small fire, some food, and the feeling of being far from everything. Life had been loud that year, and silence seemed like the only thing I craved. The gravel road leading into the forest felt endless. Thick lines of trees closed in on both sides, their branches reaching over the road like they were trying to hide it. The deeper I drove, the more the air changed. It smelled colder, even though it was warm outside, and it carried this faint scent of wet soil and old pine needles. When I finally reached the clearing that I had marked on my map earlier that month, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, though I ignored the unease like I usually did. The clearing was wide enough for my small tent and my car, with a narrow path walking deeper into the woods that I didn't plan on taking. I liked staying close to the vehicle. The grass was tall around the edges, bending under the soft wind, and the ground crunched with dry twigs. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time, stretching out the minutes of the quiet that I had supposedly come for. The sky above was a pale blue with no signs of clouds, and the sun filtered through the tops of the trees in thin golden lines. After everything was set up, I walked around the clearing, just trying to get used to the environment. There was no sound besides wind and birds, the kind that repeated the same short calls over and over. No running water, no signs of other campers, no distant engines. It was peaceful enough that I almost forgot how remote the place actually was. By late afternoon, I started a small fire with the wood I collected from the edges of the clearing. The sun began to dip behind the tree line, and shadows stretched longer and darker. I sat near the fire, eating, warming my hands, watching little sparks shoot upward every time a piece of wood snapped. Everything felt calm, maybe too calm. I kept glancing behind me even though there was nothing there but trees. As night came in, the air cooled fast. The fire was the only thing keeping me warm, and the light from it made the tall grass around the clearing look like it was moving even when the wind had died down. I could hear insects buzzing and the occasional crack from somewhere in the woods. Every time a branch snapped in the distance, my body tightened. I kept reminding myself that animals lived out here. Deer, maybe even elk. Nothing dangerous if I stayed in my spot. When it grew completely dark, the forest turned into one solid wall of black around me. The fire only lit a small circle, and beyond that circle, everything disappeared. Even the sky looked darker than before. I sat with my arms wrapped around my knees, listening, breathing slowly, trying not to imagine things moving in the shadows. I stayed out there longer than I wanted to because going into the tent felt worse. The tent felt like a thin plastic bag separating me from whatever might be walking around out there. But eventually I crawled inside. I zipped it shut, turned on my small lantern, and lay down on my sleeping bag. The lantern cast this dim glow on the inside walls, and the fabric moved slightly whenever wind brushed against it. I could still hear the fire crackling outside, though it was burning lower and lower. I must have drifted off for a few minutes, but something woke me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was just a shift in the natural noise outside, like the way silence feels different when something new has entered it. I opened my eyes and stared at the top of the tent, not moving, just listening. My heart started beating fast, and my body felt strangely warm even though the air was cold. Then I heard it again, this soft, slow crunch of dry grass. Not quick steps, not an animal rushing. Something moving with weight, with intention, stepping carefully. I stayed completely still. My breathing got quieter on its own. The steps came closer, stopping every few seconds like whoever or whatever was out there kept pausing to look around. I pictured a bear at first, but the steps didn't match. They sounded too controlled. Bears move with heavy, uneven thuds. This was slow, quiet, spaced out like someone testing the ground before each step. I could see the faint outline of the tent wall shift slightly, like something outside had passed by the fire and blocked the light for a second. My skin went cold. I waited, counting the seconds between steps. They circled halfway around my tent, then stopped completely. The silence after that was worse than the footsteps. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I kept listening for breathing, for another crack, for anything, but nothing came. It stayed silent for so long that I started wondering if I had imagined everything. Maybe I had been half asleep, but when I looked at the tent wall again, I noticed the faintest shadow. It wasn't clear, but it was tall, taller than me, and it stayed there without moving. My body locked up. My hands felt numb. I didn't know what to do. If I made noise, I'd reveal that I was awake. If I stayed silent, maybe it would eventually leave. I listened to my heartbeat pounding in my ears and tried to stay calm. Minutes passed. Real minutes, long and dragging, before the shadow finally shifted a little, like someone leaning slightly to one side. Then the steps started again, slow, retreating this time. The moment I realized the sound was moving away, my whole body felt weak. I stayed lying down until I was sure the steps were completely gone, then reached slowly for the zipper of the tent. I didn't open it. I just held it, ready, in case I needed to get out fast. But I couldn't force myself to unzip it. The idea of being outside in that darkness with something that had been right next to me felt worse than staying in the thin shelter I had. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first pale light came through the trees, I finally stepped outside. The fire had burned down to almost nothing. The clearing was colder than it had been the night before, the air sharp and still. I looked around slowly, scanning every patch of grass, every tree, every mark on the ground. I found footprints within minutes. They were human, not boot prints, not hiking shoes, bare feet, long, narrow, dirt-covered bare feet. The size looked like a grown adult's. The footprints came from the line of trees, moved around my tent in a wide circle, then went back the same way. I stood there staring at them, feeling sick, realizing that whoever had been out here wasn't lost. They weren't running or rushing. They walked right up to my tent in the middle of the night with no shoes, no light, and no sound except those soft, steady steps. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook while I rolled up the tent, and I kept glancing at the trees. Every minute felt like someone was watching me from between them. I didn't stop to eat or look around again. I just shoved everything into the car and drove out of there without checking my mirror. The entire drive back down that gravel road felt too long. Every bump, every shadow made me jump. I didn't relax until the forest opened and the road widened into the familiar stretch leading toward the highway. What scared me most wasn't the footsteps or the shadow or even the footprints. It was the way those prints moved around my tent. Slow, controlled, patient, like the person already knew I was there and just wanted to stand close enough to hear me inside. I never went back to that area. I never camped alone again after that. The ending was simple and clear in my mind even before I reached home. No matter how much I had wanted silence, that place had given it to me in the wrong way. Not the calm kind. The kind that made it obvious that someone else had been standing in the dark, quietly choosing not to leave until they wanted to. And the worst part, the part that stayed with me long after the trip, was knowing that nothing supernatural had happened. There were no creatures, no strange beings, no impossible shapes. It was just a real person out there, barefoot in the woods, walking toward a lone tent at night. And real people can be far scarier than anything else. I was 31 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip in the Lake District in northern England. It was late autumn of 2019, the kind of season where the trees looked like they were slowly burning down into gold and rust. I had been trying to clear my head after a stressful stretch of work, and 3 quiet days in the hills felt like the only thing that made sense. I packed light, just a small tent, a simple stove, basic food, and a cheap rain jacket I thought would be enough. Looking back, I should have taken the weather warnings more seriously. I reached the trailhead in the early afternoon. The clouds were already thick and low, but the air felt calm, heavy in a way that made sound feel slow. My plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles past the lower woods, follow a narrow stream up a gentle slope, and camp near a small clearing I had seen in a guidebook. It wasn't an official campsite, but many people used it because of the soft ground and the fact that the trees blocked most of the wind. Everything looked normal as I walked. The mud sucked at my boots, and the wet grass brushed cold against my legs. I could hear sheep across the hills, bells clinking faintly through the mist. I reached the clearing just before sunset. It wasn't anything special, just a patch of level ground surrounded by tall, twisted trees. But the place felt quiet in a comforting way. The stream nearby was only a few inches deep, running over smooth stones, and the sound of it made the silence feel less sharp. The sky had gone a dull, flat gray. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes into the soft soil, and boiled water for a quick meal. I remember the smell of damp earth mixing with the steam from the pot, and how the cold air felt sharp in my nose. The rain began lightly around 7. At first, it was just a soft tapping on the tent, almost relaxing. I lay inside my sleeping bag, reading from my phone until the battery slipped down to 15%. I set it aside, wanting to save some power for the next morning, and listened to the rain grow heavier. The drops hit harder, faster, turning from tapping to steady drumming. Within an hour, it was pouring, the kind of rain that feels like it has weight behind it. I should have been asleep, but the sound kept me awake. The wind began to move in sudden short bursts, bending branches above me. Every so often, a drop of water would land on my face from the condensation forming along the top of the tent. I kept checking the seams to make sure they weren't leaking. The ground felt soft under my mat, like the rain was loosening everything beneath me. Sometime after midnight, I felt the first real moment of unease. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a sense that something wasn't quite right. I heard a rustling sound to my right, far too close to the tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing branches, but the movement was slow and steady, not the quick flapping kind of noise branches usually make. I held my breath and listened. The rain was heavy, but beneath it I could hear something brushing through the wet undergrowth. Not fast, but deliberate, like someone walking with careful steps. The sound stopped, and the silence felt thicker than before. I waited for a long time, feeling my heartbeat push against my ribs. I told myself it was probably a deer. They were common in the area, and tried to force myself to relax. But something about the pattern of the steps had felt wrong. They had been too spread out, too heavy for a deer, but not heavy enough for a cow. I kept thinking about the guidebook mentioning that farmers sometimes moved livestock across the trails, but even that didn't fit. I decided I wasn't going to look outside. The rain was coming down so hard that I could hear it splashing against the soil, and unzipping the tent would have soaked everything instantly. I tried to focus on my breathing and eventually drifted into a light, uneasy half-sleep. I woke again to an even stranger noise. It sounded like something scraping against fabric, faint but too close to ignore. The noise came from the far side of the tent, slow and dragging, like fingers moving across the surface. My first thought was that it was a branch bending under the weight of the rain and brushing the tent. I reached out and pressed my palm against the wall of the fabric. I expected to feel the curve of a branch pushing in from the outside. Instead, I felt nothing. No pressure, no shape, just the cold dampness of the rain-soaked nylon. The scraping sound came again, lower this time, closer to the ground. My throat tightened. The hair on my arms lifted on its own. It wasn't loud enough to be threatening, but it was so controlled, so measured, that it made every part of me go rigid. I stayed still for what felt like hours. The rain drowned almost everything out, but I kept catching small sounds, soft steps shifting on wet leaves, the faint crack of a stick, the brushing of something moving around the tent. Not fast, not panicked, just steady, purposeful. At some point, I realized that the footsteps weren't circling anymore. They were staying in one spot, a few feet away from the tent's entrance. I could hear the water splashing slightly under the weight of something standing there. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I didn't understand why anyone would be out here at this hour, in this weather, with no light and no reason. And if it wasn't a person, then it was something large enough to stand upright and still. I stared at the zip of the tent entrance. It hung a few inches from my face. A tiny flap of fabric moved with each gust of wind. I pictured someone standing just outside, watching, trying to decide what they wanted. I felt a sudden urgency to leave, but the idea of unzipping the door and stepping out into the dark with someone, or something, waiting there made my stomach twist. The rain kept falling. Eventually the footsteps moved again, slower this time, like whatever was there had lost interest or grown tired. I listened as the steps faded into the trees, swallowed by the storm. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed sitting upright in my sleeping bag, shaking from the cold and the fear, waiting for the first sign of daylight. When I finally saw the faint gray of dawn through the thin tent fabric, the rain had stopped, but the trees still dripped heavily. I waited another 10 minutes before forcing myself to open the tent. The cold air hit my face instantly, sharp and metallic. I scanned the clearing. The ground around the entrance was disturbed. Mud pushed down in long, irregular shapes. Not boots, not hooves. Something flatter, wider, like the shape of a foot but stretched out. The impressions were ruined by the rain, but they were large enough to make my stomach drop. I didn't waste time. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely bothering to fold the tent properly. My hands were shaking so much I kept dropping things. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to be on the trail and moving away from that clearing as quickly as possible. The walk back to the car felt twice as long as the walk in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me through the trees. Every gust of wind made me flinch. Every crack of a branch made my legs move faster. By the time I reached the parking area, my clothes were damp, my boots were filled with cold water, and my nerves felt completely burned out. When I finally sat inside the car and shut the door, the silence was almost startling. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, letting the feeling of safety sink in. Nothing had chased me, nothing had followed, but something had stood outside my tent for hours during the heaviest rainstorm I'd ever camped in. Something that moved with patience, not fear. I never went back to that spot. I never reported anything because I didn't even know what I'd be reporting. All I know is that I've camped many times before and after that night, in different countries and different conditions, and nothing has ever made me feel the way that clearing did. I still hear that slow scraping sound when I think about it. I still picture those long, washed-out prints in the mud. The ending is simple. I left the hills that morning and drove home, and I haven't camped alone in the rain since. Whatever I heard that night wasn't supernatural, and I don't pretend to know what it was. But I know it was real, and I know it was watching me. And that is enough to keep me from ever sleeping in a tent alone on a rainy night again. I decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2019, something I had been wanting to do for a long time. I was 26 then, and I felt like I needed a break from everything. I chose a quiet area in the Peak District, somewhere a little away from common trails but still close enough to a dirt path that I wouldn't get completely lost. The plan was simple: spend 2 nights there, walk around during the day, read a bit, relax, and sleep early. I thought it would be peaceful. I didn't expect anything strange at all. I didn't even think anything strange could happen in a place like that. I arrived around late afternoon. The sky was gray, and the wind was cold even though it was summer. I walked for a bit until I found a flat area near a group of old trees. The ground there was soft and dry enough to set up my tent. There was a long stretch of grass behind me and a narrow path that had probably been used by hikers, but I didn't see anyone. The place felt completely empty. That emptiness was nice at first. It made me feel like I had the whole landscape to myself. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time to make sure everything was tight and stable. I always worried about tents collapsing in the middle of the night, so I double-checked the stakes, tightened the ropes, and tested the zippers. After that, I unpacked my gear, put my food in a small cooler, and walked around for a bit. The air smelled fresh, and the grass brushed against my legs. The silence felt heavy, like there was nothing but wind and my own footsteps. I liked that kind of silence. It made me feel calm. As the sun started to set, the temperature dropped fast. I made a small campfire with dry sticks and sat next to it, warming my hands. I watched the orange light shine against the dark trees and listened to the crackling fire. It felt peaceful and safe. Nothing about the moment felt wrong. I ate a simple dinner, packed everything away carefully, and put my leftover food into a container inside my tent so animals wouldn't mess with it. After that, I crawled inside my sleeping bag and rested on my back, listening to the wind brushing through the trees. I must have fallen asleep for a short while because I remember waking up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just sharp enough to catch my attention. It sounded like something stepped on a dry stick. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a fox. Those things were common in the area, so I didn't panic. But when I stayed still and listened more carefully, I realized the steps were too slow and too spaced out. They weren't the quick, light movements of an animal. They were heavy and steady, like someone walking slowly and carefully through the grass. I stayed inside my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, trying to breathe quietly. I didn't move. I didn't even lift my head. I just listened. The steps came closer but then stopped. The sudden quiet made my chest tighten. I could hear the wind again, but nothing else. I didn't know if whoever or whatever was out there was still standing nearby or had left. I eventually convinced myself I was overthinking and tried to go back to sleep. After a long time, I drifted off again. The next morning, the sun was weak, covered by pale clouds that looked like stretched out smoke. I stepped outside the tent and stretched, feeling stiff. When I looked around, I noticed something strange. About 20 feet from my tent, the grass was pressed down in a shape that looked like someone had been standing there for some time. It wasn't the shape of an animal lying down. It looked more like 2 feet had been planted firmly in that spot. The grass wasn't flattened in a messy way. It looked like someone had stood still there, facing my tent. I stared at it for a long time, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But the more I looked, the more sure I became that someone had been standing there in the dark, watching. Maybe it was a hiker passing through. Maybe it was a local farmer checking the land. I tried to make myself believe all those normal explanations. I forced myself to think that anyone walking nearby late at night would have harmless reasons. Still, I felt uneasy. I walked a bit around the camp area, trying to clear my head. I followed the dirt path for a while and came across an old wooden gate that led into a field. The entire place felt empty, quiet, and wide, with no people anywhere. That emptiness felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something could hide easily in all that space. When I returned to the camp, I noticed another strange detail. My backpack, which I had left zipped and placed against the inside of the tent, had been moved slightly. Not far, just rotated a bit, like someone had touched it or nudged it while I slept. I knew I didn't move it. I remembered exactly how I had placed it the night before. I spent the whole day feeling tense. Every little sound made me turn my head. Every rustling in the grass made me stop walking. I tried to eat lunch, but my stomach felt tight. I tried to read a book, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking around the trees, expecting to see someone standing behind them. When evening came, I debated packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to walk through fading light. I told myself it would be okay, that I would stay alert and keep my lantern on inside the tent. The second night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want any attention on me. The air felt colder, and the silence felt heavier. I got inside the tent earlier than usual, zipped everything tightly, and sat inside my sleeping bag, listening. The wind was stronger that night. The tent walls shook lightly with each gust. Hours passed like that. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try to. I just waited. Around maybe 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Slow steps in the grass. Heavy, careful. This time there was no doubt. It was a person. My whole body froze. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stayed still and stared at the wall of the tent, watching the fabric move slightly with the wind. The steps came closer and closer until they stopped right outside. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing, not loud, but close enough that I knew the person was standing only inches away from me. I could picture them standing there, listening for movement inside. My heart was beating so hard that I was scared it would give me away. I didn't move for a long time. Whoever was out there didn't move either. They just stood there, like they were waiting. The breathing would stop for a few seconds, then start again. I felt like I was going to faint. My fingers were shaking inside the sleeping bag. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the steps again, this time moving away. Slow at first, then fading into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I waited until the sky turned blue and the sun rose. The moment I saw light outside the tent, I grabbed everything I could, shoved it into my bags without folding anything, and left. I didn't even look back. I just walked fast down the path, trying to stay on solid ground until I got back to my car. When I finally reached my car, I sat inside for a long time, trying to breathe normally. I looked around the empty parking area, making sure no one was watching me. Only then did I start the engine. I didn't stop until I reached a town far from the campsite. I never found out who that man was, why he was there, or how long he had been watching me. I never went camping alone again, and I probably never will. Every time I think about it, I remember that pressed spot in the grass, those slow steps, and that silent breathing just outside the thin wall of my tent. The ending was simple but clear. I left early, I stayed safe, and I learned that being alone in a quiet place doesn't always mean you're truly alone. I still think about it sometimes, about how close that person was and how easily things could have gone wrong. But I'm alive, unharmed, and far away from that place now, and that's enough for me. I was 29 in the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a short camping trip alone in northern Colorado, near a place called Dry Ridge. It wasn't a famous spot, and that was exactly why I picked it. I didn't want crowds or noise. I wanted a quiet break away from everything, just a weekend to reset my head. Life had been too loud, too busy, and I felt like I hadn't taken a deep breath in months. I drove out late in the afternoon, with the sun still high enough to feel warm on my arms as I kept one hand out the open window. The air smelled dry, almost dusty, and the grass on both sides of the gravel road looked pale from the heat. I remember thinking it was the kind of place where time moved slower, where days felt longer. There were no buildings nearby except a closed ranger shed that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I parked my car beside a patch of short trees that didn't offer much shade, just enough to help me unload my gear without sweating too hard. The ground felt uneven under my boots, soft in some spots but firm in others. I walked around a bit, checking the area before picking a flat section near a narrow stream. The stream wasn't strong. The water moved lazily, barely making a sound. It was perfect for what I wanted: quiet, empty, still. I set up my tent slowly, taking my time to tie everything tight and hammer the stakes deep so the wind wouldn't lift the whole thing overnight. The sun started dipping lower behind the hills, turning the sky a dull orange color. The temperature dropped a little, making the air feel cooler against my skin. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, just canned food and some bread, nothing special. I wasn't there for fancy camping. I just wanted calm. After eating, I walked a little farther down the stream. The surface of the water caught the fading light, turning it into long strips of gold. For some reason, the place felt both peaceful and strangely empty, like something was missing. I brushed the thought off as nothing more than my mind overthinking in the quiet. When it got dark, I climbed into my tent, zipped the door halfway, and lay on top of my sleeping bag. I couldn't fall asleep right away. The silence felt too complete. Every so often I heard a small rustle from the grass outside or the soft push of water in the stream. Those tiny noises felt louder than they should. I kept telling myself it was just nature, just normal sounds. Sometime around midnight, I finally drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again. It couldn't have been too long. The air still felt warm, not cold like early morning. What woke me up wasn't a specific sound, but a strange sense that something had changed outside. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and immediately know something isn't right, even if you can't see it. I sat still for a moment, listening to the quiet. My tent was dark, and the fabric moved a little from a breeze that I couldn't feel inside. My heartbeat felt heavy in my ears, and every small noise outside seemed sharper. I lay back down but couldn't relax. Something felt off, something that made my skin crawl without any clear reason. After a few minutes of trying to ignore it, I decided to step out and get some cool air. Sometimes that helps when you can't sleep. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The ground felt colder under my feet, and the air smelled different. Less fresh, more damp, almost like wet soil that had been turned over recently. The moon was bright enough to light up the area. I could see my car, the stream, the uneven ground, the trees. Everything looked normal, but the feeling didn't go away. I didn't know what I expected to find, but something inside me kept pushing me to look around. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the stream. The water reflected the moonlight, and the surface looked smooth except for a few ripples. As I got closer, a smell hit me. It was faint at first, just a strange bitter scent that I couldn't place. I thought maybe it was a dead animal somewhere in the grass. That wouldn't be unusual. This area was full of wildlife. But the smell grew stronger the more I walked. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal I was familiar with. It was heavier, thicker, almost sweet in a sickening way. My stomach tightened. I stopped walking for a moment, letting the flashlight beam sweep across the grass on the opposite side of the stream. That's when I saw it. A shape lying partly in the grass and partly in the mud near the bank. At first I thought it was just a camping bag someone left behind, maybe an old backpack washed there by the stream. But the shape didn't look right for that. It was too still, too solid. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I slowly moved closer, not because I wanted to, but because my body walked forward before my mind could stop it. When I got close enough for the light to fully hit it, my legs froze. It was a body, a real human body. It lay on its side, facing away from me. The clothes were dirty and torn in places, smeared with mud, dried blood, and dark patches that looked older. The person didn't move at all. The skin that was visible looked pale, almost gray under the moonlight. The position of the limbs looked unnatural, twisted slightly like the person had fallen hard and hadn't been moved since. My throat felt tight, and my hands went cold. I backed up slowly, my boots pressing deep into the soft ground. The air around the body smelled stronger now, the thick decay pushing into my nose, making me feel lightheaded. I didn't want to look closer. I didn't want to see the face. I already knew the person was dead. The stillness in the air made it very clear. I turned around and started walking fast back toward my tent. Every part of me wanted to run, but I forced myself not to. Running felt like it might attract something, even though I didn't know what. My chest felt tight, my breathing thin. My mind kept replaying the shape of the body, the way it lay half in the mud, the pale skin, the smell. I couldn't think straight. When I reached my tent, I didn't go inside. I crouched next to it, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to leave. I knew that instantly. Nothing good could come from staying near a dead person in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around. It wasn't just fear. It was instinct. Something about the scene felt wrong in a deeper way, like whoever the person was had not simply fallen or gotten lost. I grabbed my keys and shoved everything I could into the back seat without caring how it landed. My heart hammered as I kept checking the trees around me, half expecting someone to appear. The air felt thicker, heavier, and I could still smell the faint rot even from far away. My hands shook as I tossed the last bags inside and slammed the door. The drive back to the road felt endless. The gravel popped loudly under my tires, and every bump made me flinch. I kept looking at the rearview mirror even though I didn't know what I expected to see. The sky remained dark, but it felt like something was pressing against my back the entire time, like the darkness itself was watching me leave. When I reached the highway, I didn't slow down. I drove straight into the next town, parked in a gas station lot, and stayed there with the engine running for a long time. My hands were still shaking. My clothes smelled like dirt and cold air. I sat there until I felt steady enough to call the sheriff's office and report what I found. They asked where it was, and I told them. They said they would send people out, and I believed them. I didn't go back. I didn't want to see it again. Later, I heard that the body belonged to a missing hiker who had been searched for a few weeks earlier. They didn't release all the details, but they said it looked like he had died from a fall, probably slipping near the bank during the night. They said he had been out there longer than they expected, and heavy rain might have moved him closer to the stream. I accepted the explanation because it made sense. Nature can be brutal and accidents happen, but something in the way the body lay, the strange twisted position, the smell, and the quiet heaviness of the place made me feel like the story was only half true. I haven't camped alone since that night. I still enjoy nature, but not in the same way. The silence no longer feels peaceful. Feels like something waiting. When I think back to that night, I can still see the pale skin under the moonlight and smell the damp, rotting air. And every time I remember it, I feel that same cold pressure on my back, like the darkness behind me is reminding me of what I saw and how close I was to stepping on it without knowing. I picked a random stretch of forest in northern Wyoming for my weekend trip, a place I had never camped before. It was late September of 2019, and the weather was already colder than I expected. I was 27 back then, stubborn and convinced I needed a few days away from people and noise. I drove out alone with my pack, my old tent, a basic knife, a camp stove, and a cooler that barely fit in the back of my car. I reached the trailhead around noon and started the hike in, moving deeper into the woods than I normally would. The air felt clean but sharp, and the sky had that thin, pale look it gets before the days start shortening faster. I didn't choose any official campsite. I walked until my legs were tired and then went off trail slightly to set up on a flat patch between a cluster of tall spruce trees. The ground was dry enough, though covered in needles and cold earth. As I pitched my tent, I could hear nothing except the wind brushing through the branches and the soft clicks of insects somewhere in the undergrowth. It felt empty in a comforting way. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, and watched the sun fade behind the tree line. The cold settled quickly after that, biting into my fingers even with gloves on. I crawled into my tent early, bundled in my sleeping bag, and listened to the forest breathe around me. Nothing strange happened that first night, aside from a few animals moving around in the distance. Deer maybe, something lighter than a bear. Normal stuff. The next morning I woke up at dawn, shivering even though I'd slept in layers. The air smelled like wet soil even though it hadn't rained. I stepped out of my tent and looked around, stretching my stiff back. That was when I noticed something odd. The pine needles around my campsite were disturbed in a way that didn't match my movements from the day before. There were long, shallow marks in the ground, almost like someone had dragged something heavy but narrow across the earth. They weren't claw marks or tracks I recognized. They were lines, just thin lines, leading from the trees toward the backside of my tent, then looping away. At first I thought maybe a branch had fallen and rolled, or maybe some animal had pulled something across the ground. But I didn't see any broken branches or signs of an animal dragging prey. I brushed it off. Maybe I had stepped wrong or kicked something without remembering. I tried not to overthink it. I spent the day hiking along a ridge that offered a distant view of the snowy peaks to the west. The wind up there was sharp enough to sting my face, but the scenery was worth it. I didn't see anyone the entire time, not even far off on the trails. By late afternoon, my legs were sore and my throat felt dry from breathing the cold air, so I headed back. When I reached my campsite, something felt off immediately. I couldn't name it, but it was a heavy feeling in my gut. My tent looked the same, untouched. My food bags were still tied up in the tree where I had hung them, but the air felt still in a strange way, as if the forest around me was holding its breath. I tried to ignore that feeling too. I cooked dinner, ate it slowly, and sat on a fallen log listening to the fading light. As evening settled, the forest sounds changed, and not in the normal way. Usually animals get quieter as the night deepens, but this was different. Everything went dead silent too early, almost unnaturally early. Even the wind stalled. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else. That uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time, like someone watching me from between the trees. I kept glancing around. I saw nothing. No shapes. No shadows moving. Nothing that explained the crawling sensation under my skin. I forced myself to get into the tent once it got too cold to sit outside. Inside, I zipped myself in, clicked on my small lantern, and tried to read a book to take my mind off my nerves. It worked for a while. Then I felt it. Just after midnight, the ground near my tent seemed to shift slightly. Not like footsteps, more like something brushing over the needles again. A light scraping sound. It was faint but close, very close. I held my breath. The scraping moved slowly along the side of the tent, then paused. I didn't dare move. I didn't have any weapon except my knife, which suddenly felt useless. The sound moved again, this time toward the back of the tent, exactly where those strange lines had been earlier in the morning. I stayed completely still, focusing on breathing as quietly as possible. I could hear my sleeping bag rustle slightly with my heartbeat. The scraping sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded. I stayed frozen for at least an hour after that, listening, waiting, barely blinking. The forest stayed silent. At some point I fell asleep, but it wasn't real sleep, just drifting in and out, my body refusing to fully relax. When I stepped out at dawn, the cold hit me first. The second thing that hit me was fear. There were more lines scratched into the ground now, circling part of my tent. Some were fresh, cutting through the thin frost that had formed overnight. They weren't deep, and they weren't footprints. It looked like someone had dragged a stick or metal rod or something similar around the tent. But if it was a person, why would they circle the tent like that? Why not approach directly? Why not say anything or leave signs of actual footsteps? I looked carefully for boot prints. Nothing, not even faint impressions. I told myself it could have been an animal after all, maybe something dragging a branch. But branches don't make perfect, smooth, narrow lines that loop and curve like controlled movements. I felt a burning urge to leave, and that sudden clarity scared me even more than the lines. I'm not the type to cut a trip short over weird noises, but something was deeply wrong here. I packed my gear fast, barely eating or drinking anything. My hands shook the entire time, not from cold but from that instinct that tells you something is wrong long before your mind catches up. As I stuffed the tent into its bag, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. The forest remained empty, too empty. The hike back felt twice as long as the hike in. Every cracking twig behind me made me turn around. Every gust of wind made my heart jump. I walked fast, almost running at times, my breath turning to steam in front of me. The deeper I went toward the trailhead, the more convinced I became that someone had been near my tent that night. Not an animal, someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who moved quietly enough to circle my tent in the dark. Someone who made no footsteps but dragged something lightly across the ground. By the time I reached my car, the fear had settled into a dull, steady ache in my stomach. I threw my pack inside, got in, and locked the doors immediately. Only then did I notice what finally made everything click. On the passenger side window, faint but visible in the thin morning light, was a narrow streak of dirt. A long, smooth line drawn across the glass. Just one. A single line. I hadn't parked near any bushes or trees. Nothing could have brushed the window naturally. I wiped it away with my sleeve, started the engine, and didn't look back as I drove away. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the empty road behind me. I never figured out what caused those markings, and I didn't report it because I didn't have anything useful to tell. No face, no description, no proof beyond a pattern in dirt and a feeling in my gut. But I haven't camped alone since that weekend. The forest is still beautiful to me, still something I love, but I'm not stupid enough to pretend that being deep in the woods means being completely alone. Whatever was out there with me that night had been close enough to circle my tent without a sound, close enough to touch my car before I even arrived. And I'm certain of one thing now. Sometimes the scariest encounters aren't the ones you see, but the ones that move around you quietly, letting you know in small ways that you were never actually alone. I planned that trip in late September of 2019, when the weather in northern Arizona had started to cool down, but the nights were still warm enough to sleep outside without feeling miserable. I had been working long hours at a small auto shop in Reno and wanted a full break from everything. No phone, no people, no traffic, nothing. I picked a quiet patch of land near the Kaibab National Forest, not too far from the Utah border. I had been there once years before with family, but this time I wanted to be alone to clear my head. I was 29 then, old enough to know better and still young enough to ignore that feeling. I drove out early in the morning, taking my time along the empty roads. The land out there stretches the way your mind stretches when you stare too long at nothing. Wide, burnt orange soil, scattered brush, long lines of pine trees in the distance, and a sky that feels too big for a single person. My old silver truck rattled every mile, and I kept glancing at the fuel gauge even though I had filled the tank before leaving. When you're far from towns, even normal noises feel like warnings. By late afternoon, I found a flat clearing far from the dirt road. The ground was dry and cracked, with small rocks that clicked under my boots as I walked. I picked a spot near a thin line of trees, their trunks dark and twisted from years of wind. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and took a slow walk around the area to see what was nearby. The air smelled like pine sap and dust. Small animal tracks crossed the dirt, but nothing fresh. Felt like no one had been out there for days. When the sun started to sink, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a fire and warmed a can of chili, listening to the wind slide through the branches. The sky turned a deep blue, then black, and the stars came out so sharp and clear they almost looked fake. It was the kind of night that makes you feel both lucky and uneasy, like something could be watching from the dark and you wouldn't know until it moved. I stayed outside for a while, letting the fire die slowly. When I finally crawled into my tent, I felt calm. I thought the night would be quiet. It wasn't. I woke up sometime around 2 in the morning. I couldn't tell why at first. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a noise I fully understood. It was more of a shift in the air, like something in the environment had changed enough to pull me out of sleep. I lay still, listening to my heartbeat. The wind had stopped completely. The forest felt frozen. Then I heard soft crunching on the ground. Not fast, not heavy, but slow and spaced apart. The steps didn't match any animal I had heard before. They weren't the quick taps of a small creature or the heavy thuds of something large. These were careful steps, like someone testing where to place their feet. I stayed as still as I could, breathing through my nose, my ears straining. The steps moved along the edge of my campsite, circling wider than the glow of the fire pit. I remembered then that the moon was thin that night, offering almost no light. The footsteps paused, and I could feel the silence press against the tent walls. I imagined someone standing a few yards away, staring straight at the shape of my tent. I felt a slow, cold wave crawl through my chest. My sleeping bag felt like a trap, pinning me down. My mind kept repeating that I was miles from anyone, far off the road, too far for someone to just stumble out there by mistake. The footsteps started again, even slower this time, and drifted off toward the tree line. I listened until I couldn't hear anything at all. I didn't move for almost an hour. When I finally fell asleep again, it was only because my body couldn't stay awake any longer. When the sun came up, I crawled out of the tent and scanned the campsite. I hoped maybe it had been an animal, maybe my tired mind had made it sound human. But the prints on the ground weren't shaped like paws. They weren't shaped like boots either. They were too narrow and too long, pressed lightly into the dirt, as if the person had been walking on the front part of their feet. I followed the trail for a while into the trees until it vanished into a patch of hard ground. I tried to stay calm. People hike out there all the time. Maybe someone was camping nearby and wandered through without thinking. But the way the steps circled my tent didn't feel like someone passing by. Felt like someone watching. I decided to stay one more night, though a part of me already knew I should pack up and leave. Something about giving up and rushing home made me feel pathetic. I convinced myself I had imagined the worst of it. I spent the whole day exploring a ridge a few miles from camp. The view stretched out for miles in every direction, dry land and dark pines and a long narrow canyon to the east. I stayed out there until the sun started to lower again. When I returned, everything at camp looked untouched. But as I set my pack down, something caught my eye. A small rock, one that I hadn't seen there before, sat perfectly centered on top of my folded jacket near the tent. I knew I hadn't put it there. The shape was too smooth, too round, like someone had picked it carefully. The hairs on my arms rose. I scanned the trees. Everything looked the same, but the quiet felt heavy again. I stuffed the rock deep into my pack, even though I didn't know why. Maybe some part of me didn't want to leave it behind like a message. The sky turned dark faster than the night before, and I didn't bother making a fire. I didn't want to give off light. I sat in my tent with my flashlight off, listening. Every sound outside felt sharper. The crunch of a pine needle, the faint shift of wind, my own breathing. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time they came from the opposite side. Slow, uneven, careful. My skin prickled as they circled the tent again, almost the same path as the night before. I clenched my fists, trying to keep quiet even though my breathing felt too loud. The steps stopped right at the back of the tent. I could feel the exact spot, like a cold point pressing through the thin fabric. I couldn't move. My muscles locked in place. I waited for the zipper to move, for a hand to grab the tent wall, for something to happen. Anything. But nothing did. The steps retreated again, slower than before, until they faded into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I waited for the sun like it was the only thing keeping me alive. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I froze. A second rock sat by the fire pit, this one flatter and darker than the one from before. Next to it was a small line drawn in the dirt, 3 short scratches, spaced evenly apart. I had no idea what they meant, but my stomach twisted the moment I saw them. I packed everything within minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't look around. I didn't even check for more tracks. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into the truck, and drove out of that place so fast the tires spat dust for a long trail behind me. Only when I reached the highway did I start to breathe normally again. For weeks after returning home, I kept checking my backyard at night, watching the shadows between my house and the fence. I kept imagining those slow, careful steps somewhere outside, waiting for me to fall asleep. I never figured out who or what had been out there. No missing hiker reports, no stories from locals, nothing. But I still have those 2 rocks. I didn't mean to keep them, but when I unpacked my bags, they were still buried at the bottom. I couldn't bring myself to throw them out, and I don't know why. They sit in a small drawer under my bed, far from sight but never far from mind. And the part that stays with me the most isn't the noise or the steps or even the rocks. It's the feeling that whoever was out there didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't act wild or confused. They moved slowly, calmly, like they had all the time in the world. Like watching someone sleep was normal to them. That's the part one can't shake, because people only move that quietly when they've done it before. I drove out to northern Arizona in late October of 2019, wanting a break from work and noise. I was 27 then, tired of screens and alarms and the steady pressure of the city. I picked an area a little west of Tuba City, somewhere far from the highway but close enough to dirt roads I could manage with my old SUV. I wasn't trying to explore anything dangerous or strange. I just wanted peace, a night alone, and the kind of quiet you only get in wide, empty land. The weather was dry but cold enough that the air stung my nose when I stepped out to set up the tent. The landscape around me looked endless, flat stretches of scrub, low broken hills, and distant mesas with sharp edges glowing orange as the sun dropped. I didn't see any cars, any hikers, any signs that people had been around recently. The ground was dusty, packed hard by years of wind. Even my footprints looked strange, barely sinking in. I set up the tent slowly, trying to calm my breathing after the long drive. My hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. Once the tent was done, I gathered a small ring of rocks for a fire, even though I planned to keep it tiny. I wasn't trying to make light or noise. I wanted the opposite. I wanted that feeling of being tucked away where no one cared what I was doing. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The wind went from a soft push to long, steady gusts that shook dry branches. I sat by the small fire, eating a simple meal from a metal container, listening to the crackle of wood and the constant rustle of desert plants bending under the wind. Nothing felt strange yet, Nothing felt wrong. It was just empty land, cold air, and the comfort of knowing I had no one to answer to for the night. Eventually, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent. I lay there listening to the nylon walls shake. The moon was bright enough that its light filtered through the material, giving the tent this dim, silvery glow. Took a while before I felt myself drifting towards sleep. Not long after that, the first sound came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear. It was just this brief scraping sound somewhere outside. Something dragging lightly along the dirt or against a rock. I didn't move at first. I convinced myself it was a branch or a small animal. But then it came again, a slow scratch that lasted longer this time. I could feel the tiny hairs on my arms rising because it didn't sound random. It sounded like something making its way across the ground with intention, like someone or something moving carefully so as not to be noticed. I stayed still, breathing shallow, hoping it would fade. The wind blew again, and for a moment everything blended together. I shut my eyes and forced myself to stay calm. But then the footsteps began. Not heavy ones. Not the kind that stomp or even walk normally. These were uneven, like someone shifting their weight wrong, like they were testing the ground before each step. Soft but deliberate. A bit too slow for an animal, but too light for a grown human walking normally. The footsteps circled around the tent in a wide arc. I felt my throat tighten as I listened. My body already knew something was off, even though my brain tried to explain it away. I reached instinctively toward my bag near my sleeping pad where I'd kept a small camping knife. Just the touch of it made me feel a little steadier. I didn't open the tent or make a sound. I just waited. The footsteps stopped behind the tent. Then came the breathing. It wasn't heavy or wheezing. It was steady, controlled, like someone trying to stay quiet but too close for me not to hear it. I felt every muscle in my back lock up. The breathing stayed there for maybe 10 long seconds. Then another sound joined it, a faint shuffle, as if the person or animal was adjusting their stance. Then everything went quiet. So quiet I could hear the blood in my ears. I stayed awake for hours, barely moving, refusing to unzip the tent. My mind kept drifting to the stories I'd heard from people in this region, stories I'd always assumed were exaggerated or symbolic. Things about figures that walked like humans but weren't, things that studied people from just out of sight. I'd never believed any of it. I didn't want to believe any of it now. But fear has a way of stripping away all the excuses you tell yourself. Eventually, sometime near dawn, the sky started to lighten. Not much, just enough to shift the color inside the tent. I took that chance to sit up and listen. Nothing moved outside. The wind had calmed. The whole world sounded empty again. I unzipped the tent very slowly and stepped out, my breath fogging faintly in the early cold. At first glance, everything looked normal. My fire ring was still there. My SUV was parked where I left it. The hills looked the same, but the ground around the back of the tent had marks, strange ones. They didn't look like boot prints. They didn't look like paw prints either. They were smudged shapes, long, dragged, like someone had walked on the very edges of their feet or on limbs that didn't bend the way they should. The dirt was disturbed in a looping path around the tent, wide at first, then tighter the closer it came. I followed the marks with my eyes until they faded into the open land. I didn't waste time after that. I packed everything as fast as I could without running. Several times I stopped because I felt like something was watching me from the low ridges, but every time I looked, there was nothing except desert and shadow. When I finally drove away, I kept glancing in the mirrors. The farther I got from that spot, the more the fear changed into a heavy, lingering unease. It sat in my stomach like a cold stone. I didn't understand what had been out there, but I knew it wasn't a normal animal. It had moved around me with too much intention. It had watched me for too long. It had come too close. I didn't tell anyone when I got home. Not at first. I didn't want people assuming I was frightened by nothing or imagining shapes in the dark. So I tried to settle back into normal life, work, chores, the dull rhythm of responsibility. But nights became harder. Every uneven sound outside my apartment pulled me back to that tent, to that breathing, to the marks circling around me. I started waking up in the middle of the night, heart rushing, convinced something was standing behind my door. I knew it wasn't logical, but fear doesn't need logic. It just needs memory. Weeks later, after I couldn't ignore the tension anymore, I looked up more information about the area I'd camped in. Most sources were simple: wildlife notes, hiking warnings, temperature charts. But tucked between them were older reports, scattered accounts from travelers and locals describing figures moving strangely at night, shapes that looked human from far away but weren't quite right when seen up close, things that avoided towns and roads but followed campers who went too far into the quiet places. I didn't want to believe any of it. I still don't claim I know what I encountered, but I know what I heard. I know how close it came. I know the marks it left. And sometimes the most reasonable explanation is not the safest one. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. Not in deserts, not in forests, not anywhere isolated. I still love nature, but I keep my distance from places where the land feels empty enough that anything can move without being seen. I learned something that night, something simple but sharp enough to stay with me. You can believe you are alone in wide open land. You can believe nothing is watching you. But the desert has a way of hiding things that move like you, sound like you, and know how to get close without making a mistake. And if one of those things decides to stand outside your tent, listening to your breathing through thin nylon walls, you will understand a kind of fear that doesn't fade when the sun comes up. I left that campsite as soon as light reached the ground, and I never returned. I don't need to. Some experiences are clear enough the first time. Some things follow you only once, and that was enough for me.